Good morning. My name is Danielle Smith, and I'm the City of Albany's Housing Services Advocate. Thank you for joining me this morning on this webinar about legal processes and protections for tenants in the City of Albany. This is part of a program that the city has recently launched called Good Neighbor School, which is focused on education for landlords and tenants about their respective rights and responsibilities, as well as the resources that are currently available during COVID-19. So for anyone who's newer to Zoom, you'll see either at the top or the bottom of your screen, there should be a control panel. You'll be able to use the Q&A function on the control panel to ask any questions that you have throughout this webinar. And I'll pause periodically between sections to answer any questions that come up. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and get started on legal processes and protections for renters. So the first section of this presentation is just going to focus essentially on an introduction to housing court in the City of Albany. So housing court in the City of Albany is part of the Albany City Court. These types of cases that are handled in Albany City Court with housing involve evictions, small claims issues, so that could include things like rental arrears or security deposits, and essentially any other legal issues that come up between landlords and tenants. In Albany, our city court is located inside of Albany City Hall, which is at 24 Eagle Street, and the court is on the second floor in room 209. If you need to get in touch with the civil part of Albany City Court, you can reach them on most days except for holidays, weekdays, 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. Their phone number is 518-453-4640, and their email is albanycivilcourt@nycourts.gov. So the following are just some of our general tips for appearing in court, whether you have a case that's filed against you, or maybe if you filed a case against a landlord. So the first would be to arrive early. Plan on giving yourself at least half an hour of extra time before your scheduled court hearing. The reason for that is that City Hall does have security measures you'll have to go through. You may have to walk around a little bit and find the courtroom, although there are people there who can give you directions, of course. And currently, and at different times throughout the pandemic, there have also been COVID screening measures that you would have to complete. So it's a good idea just to show up a bit early, give yourself some extra time to do all of those things. You should also be aware that there might actually be multiple cases scheduled for the same time slot. So let's say your case is scheduled for 9:30 a.m. There could actually be 4 matters set for 9:30 a.m. And they'll get called usually between 9:30 and the next time slot, which is 10 a.m. So your case may not be the first one called, so you'll just want to be aware of that and be patient. In terms of what to wear to court, certain types of clothing would be discouraged or sometimes are even prohibited. For example, if you're wearing a hat, the court officer will most likely ask you to remove it. Clothing that's going to be very informal, such as like a logo sweatshirt or wearing really ripped jeans, or clothing that is really revealing is also discouraged in court. You just want to appear as professional as you can. You'll also want to be sure that you are showing respect for the court and the judge. So you'll notice that when the judge comes into the room, the court officer will say, "All rise," and everyone will stand up. That's a way of showing respect to the judge. And if you do speak to the judge directly, you can address them by saying "Your Honor" or "Judge." When it's your turn to speak, you'll want to speak very calmly and clearly and explain your situation as simply as you can. And most of the time, the judge will not like it if you share unnecessary details or talk about unrelated issues. They may actually redirect you to stay on topic or ask that you bring your focus back to the matter at hand. And you'll also want to make sure that you are addressing the judge and not your landlord. The judge may ask you some questions while you're speaking, and if you don't know what a question means, it's really important that you ask for clarification. and that you don't answer a question if you don't know what it means. The reason for that is that lying in court, also known as perjury, is against the law. So you'll just want to make sure that you don't accidentally answer a question incorrectly because you aren't sure what something means. Most of the time, the judge would be happy to explain to you what's going on or what a certain term means. And finally, it's very important to not interrupt others in court, especially the judge. But your landlord, this goes for your landlord as well. So even if your landlord says something that isn't true or you don't agree with, you'll want to wait until it's your turn to speak. The judge will usually give you an opportunity to respond to what your landlord has said. So go ahead and pause for any questions about general civil court in Albany. So the eviction process in Albany essentially follows the steps here in this flow chart. So tenants will receive an eviction notice. There are a few different types of notices that tenants in Albany may receive. You would then receive a petition for eviction, followed by having several court dates. And then essentially the case would be decided by the judge, or it could be dismissed. So when it comes to eviction notices, there are a few different kinds of eviction notices that we see in New York. So the most common in Albany would be a demand for rent. So this would essentially be if you haven't paid rent, your landlord can give you a 14-day notice that says if you don't pay within the next 14 days, your landlord is intending to file an eviction against you. If you have violated the terms of your lease, the landlord can give you what's called a notice to cure. And your landlord does have to give you a chance to fix any violations that have led to your eviction. So this essentially tells you what the problem is and gives you a certain amount of time to fix it. And for any other types of evictions, your landlord has to give you at least a 10-day notice called a notice of termination, which is essentially telling you that your lease is done. The next step would be for your landlord to actually go to the court and file what's called a petition for eviction. They would then have to give you, the tenant, a copy. They would have to serve you with a copy of that petition. The petition for eviction explains what the eviction is for, and it also sets a date and time for a court appearance. The first court appearance in the city of Albany is called an initial appearance. One feature that's unique to our city court in Albany is that these appearances actually have a first call and a second call. So the matter, let's say that there's an eviction case and the initial hearing is set for today at 10 a.m. The judge would go for first call at 10 a.m. If one or both parties is missing at 10 a.m., then the judge would wait at least an hour until 11 a.m. and call it up for second call. At that time, if the landlord or the tenant isn't present, the judge would proceed without them. But with that being said, it's still a good idea to show up on time just to keep everything moving smoothly in court and to show that you are a professional. During the initial appearance hearing, the judge will briefly hear from both parties. You will have a chance to explain your side of the situation as well. And if the landlord and the tenant are unable to resolve the matter between them during that first hearing, then the judge would set a date for an eviction trial. So depending on the situation or the type of case, there may be other hearings or court dates in between. This could be anything such as a control date to make sure that a certain document gets submitted by a date, to having additional hearings, anything like that. And again, that would really just depend on the case, but you should be notified of any additional hearings that you have. And then finally, if the parties are still unable to resolve the issues, an eviction trial would be set. So during this trial, both the tenant and the landlord will have the opportunity to go to court and make their case. Both the tenant and the landlord will be able to bring any witnesses or documents that they need to back up their side of the story. And in Albany, we do see that most of the time landlords in court do have an attorney. Currently in Albany and in New York State, tenants do not have the right to counsel. So that means that unlike in some other types of court cases, such as in a criminal case where you would have a public defender appointed to you, tenants in Albany do not get a lawyer appointed to them for eviction hearings. However, if you do want to have legal representation in eviction court, which is always a good idea to try and make that happen, I would recommend contacting the Legal Aid Society. Their legal hotline is 833-628-0087. So after the eviction trial, if the tenant loses an eviction court, then this would be referred to as an eviction judgment. So after an eviction judgment, the landlord can ask the court for a warrant of eviction. The warrant cannot be carried out until at least 14 days after the judgment has occurred. So it does give a little bit of time for the tenant to make other arrangements. And this warrant needs to be signed by the judge, and it has to be given to the Albany County Sheriff to actually be executed. So even if a landlord has a warrant, this doesn't mean that they can show up and change your locks. They have to give the order to the sheriff to serve it themselves. So if a warrant is signed against you and let's say it's a non-payment eviction and you now are able to pay your rent, or if you've applied for EREP during that time, you should inform your landlord immediately. And if your landlord refuses to cancel the eviction warrant, you should call both the Albany City Court at 518-453-4640 or Albany County Sheriff at 518-487-5400. So even up until the point that there is a warrant signed against you, you can call and explain that you can now pay your debt or that you've applied for assistance. And you should tell them that you want to cancel the warrant and have your case sent back to court. You would then receive a new hearing date. You would be able to go to court and explain to the judge that you can pay your rent now or that you've applied for assistance and this warrant should be canceled. So one other more recent change that has occurred in housing law in Albany is the Albany Good Cause Eviction Law. So this essentially means now that your landlord can no longer bring an eviction case against you except for certain good cause reasons. So these would be things most commonly such as non-payment of rent, violating the lease, anything like that, but it does not include an expired lease. So just to reiterate, your landlord cannot bring an eviction case against you only because your lease has expired. However, if you as a tenant refuse to sign a new lease agreement, then that may be grounds for an eviction. There is an exception. The landlord can evict a tenant if they or an immediate family member needs to move in. And this law also doesn't apply to owner-occupied properties with 4 or fewer units. So for example, if you live in a duplex and your landlord lives upstairs, then you would not be covered under the good cause eviction law. Go ahead and pause for a minute in case there's any questions about the eviction process. All right. So some of the questions that we get most commonly from tenants who are facing an eviction in Albany, the first would just be, what do I do if I get an eviction notice? And we do tend to see a few different ways that people respond to getting an eviction notice. These include fight, flight, or freeze. And we always tell people that if you do get an eviction notice, the worst thing that you can do is to do nothing. So as you get papers or court notices, pay attention to any deadlines or court dates. You can write them down, put them on your calendar, or put them in your phone. And if there are any steps that you can take to fix the issue that's led to the eviction, then you can also see if there is perhaps something you can do to remedy the situation. So for example, if you are being evicted for a lease violation, maybe that's something that you can fix to resolve the situation. If you're being evicted for non-payment, you could maybe talk to your landlord about setting up a payment plan or look into rental assistance options. And again, if you are facing eviction, you should contact the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York if you would be interested in speaking to an attorney about your case. So another question that we get is how soon someone could actually be evicted after they've received a notice. So under normal circumstances, eviction court moves pretty quickly within a couple of months. However, due to COVID-19, there is a large backlog of cases moving through Albany City Court. In addition, New York State renters who are experiencing a hardship due to COVID-19 are actually protected from eviction until January 15th of 2022. Apologies for the typo there. However, it is important to know that this protection only applies to tenants who have filled out a hardship declaration form, which we'll talk about in a later section. And your landlord also has the right to challenge your declaration. And just keep in mind again that if you were to fill out this form after not being impacted financially by COVID-19, then you could face penalties for perjury or lying to the court. So if you have been impacted by COVID-19 and you're facing eviction, by all means, please do fill out this form. I did touch on this briefly before, but another question we get sometimes is whether or not someone will have an attorney in court. So as I said, tenants in Albany do not currently have a right to counsel, which means that you will not have a lawyer appointed to you in eviction court. But renters do have the option of seeking an attorney on their own, whether that's someone they hire, or you also can contact the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York for free legal assistance. And again, that's their number on the screen there. Tenants also sometimes ask whether they have to go to court or if they should go to court. So legally, unlike in a lot of other court matters, you are not required to show up to court for a civil case, including an eviction. So that means that if you miss your eviction court date, you wouldn't be arrested for failing to appear. However, if you don't go to court, you also won't have the opportunity to have your side of the story heard by the judge. And there may be things that you've experienced, such as persistent code violations, and maybe you've been withholding rent because of that. The judge wouldn't have the opportunity to hear your side of the story if you don't go to court, and the judge may also issue a default judgment against you. And again, if you're unable to make it to court, it would be a good idea to reach out to legal aid, because you would then be able to have a lawyer show up on your behalf, even if you had childcare or work or some other issue that prevented you from actually being there. Question number 5. Is it true that my landlord cannot evict me if the unit has no ROP? So currently what we've been seeing is that Albany City Court judges don't routinely ask whether or not the property has an ROP or a residential occupancy permit. Up until now, the responsibility has usually been on the tenant to show up in court and make that argument. But if the judge becomes aware that the unit doesn't have an ROP, then they are supposed to prevent that eviction. So if you'd like to know if your apartment has an ROP, you can contact the Department of Buildings and Regulatory Compliance. They do have a list of ROP properties on their website, so you can see every ROP that's valid in the city of Albany, and that gets updated every few months. And you can also give them a call at 518-434-5410. Go ahead and pause for a moment if anyone has any questions about those FAQs. All right. So the following section will be covering some of the eviction protections that tenants have in New York State under COVID-19. So during the beginning of the pandemic, New York State passed the Tenant Safe Harbor Act, and this piece of legislation essentially protects New York State renters who have been impacted by COVID financially from experiencing an eviction if they've experienced that financial hardship. So some examples of a financial hardship that would qualify someone for these protections would include being on unemployment. So a lot of people, of course, lost their jobs or lost income. Maybe they lost hours or had their wages reduced. But some other examples of qualifying situations could be increased expenses. So some families perhaps didn't have access to childcare during the pandemic, and then had increased costs of having children home more often, for example. Other families may have had medical bills or funeral expenses, essentially anything like that that was caused by COVID that caused a financial hardship would qualify someone for these eviction protections. And currently, the New York Tenant Safe Harbor Act is set to expire on January 15th of 2022. After that time, any tenant will be able to be evicted again. So it's also really important for tenants to realize that these protections are not automatic. So in order to actually benefit from the eviction protections, the tenant will have to fill out a document called the Tenant's Declaration of Hardship during the COVID-19 pandemic. It's just a simple form that you would fill out stating that you've been impacted financially by COVID and that you would be at risk for either adverse health outcomes or adverse housing outcomes if you were to be evicted. Your landlord is supposed to give you a copy of that form if they serve you with eviction papers during this time. But if you need a copy, you can also download it from newyorkcourts.gov, or you can pick up a paper copy at Albany City Court, which is again inside of Albany City Hall at 24 Eagle Street. Or you can also pick up a copy of the declaration here at our office at 200 Henry Johnson Boulevard. And again, this is the form that a tenant needs to fill out if they want to be protected from eviction until January. Go ahead and pause for a minute in case there's any questions about the COVID eviction protections. All right, seeing none, the last section of this presentation will touch on how a tenant can file a housing lawsuit if they feel that they need to bring a lawsuit against their own landlord. So some of the reasons why tenants may feel the need to file a housing lawsuit would include an issue with the security deposit. For example, if a landlord fails to return a deposit, seeking to reduce rent due to poor living conditions. So that's called a rent abatement. If the tenant has experienced discrimination or mistreatment from their landlord, or if the tenant has experienced injuries or maybe has had property damage caused by the landlord's actions or by negligence. It is possible for a tenant to file a housing lawsuit by themselves, and there are some resources available from newyorkcourts.gov to help with that. They do have a small claims handbook, and again, most of these situations that I mentioned above would fall under small claims actions. However, with that being said, the legal process can be difficult and confusing if you're not an attorney, and it can be difficult to navigate this without an attorney. So again, if you need legal assistance, you can contact the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York for help with filing a case. And the following are some legal resources that can help, whether you're filing a case on your own, whether you're facing eviction or have a case filed against you, or whether you're looking to file a case against your landlord with the help of an attorney. So the first would be Albany City Court, the civil part. This is a good resource for general court information. If you just want to learn more about the court, or for example, if you don't remember when you had a court date, you can call and they'd be happy to look that up for you. As I mentioned, New York Courts does have some free self-help court resources. Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York. Again, they offer free civil legal advice and representation. So they are a good resource for anyone who is facing eviction and is looking for representation, as well as if you are having an issue with your landlord that you think you will need to go to court for. if maybe you're having an issue that you don't think is necessarily going to be a court matter, I would also recommend reaching out to United Tenants of Albany. They do have a legal helpline, which is a housing hotline, which is 518-436-8997. And UTA generally can provide you with just sort of general advocacy and tenant assistance. They do provide rental assistance, and they also do landlord-tenant mediation services. And finally, this is my contact information. So if you have any questions about the material covered in this presentation, or if you need any help navigating resources, please feel free to reach out. My name again is Danny Smith, and I'm the city's housing services advocate, and I can be reached by phone at 518-694-0066 or by email at dsmith@albanyny.gov. So seeing no final questions, we'll go ahead and close out for the day. Thank you so much for joining me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your morning. Thank you so much. Take care.